Hello, gang. This is Tony Torres with Defense Lab Tactical and Edge Protection Systems. Today we're talking guns, but we're going to get around to it the long way. That's right, Second Amendment, self-defense, and all those things. As always, if you have any questions, leave your comments below or contact me directly. So, inherently to being a human being that's alive on this planet, you have a right to self-preservation. Regardless of how you believe you were created or you got here, you have a right to continue to exist and to try to be happy, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and all those things. And that includes your right to preserve yourself from somebody that's trying to do violent things to you. Now, we live in a modern world, edit that, Rusty. We live in a modern world in which firearms exist. So how do they factor into the whole self-defense picture? Well, if you have a right to self-defense, another thing you want to look at is if you're an able-bodied human being, it should go beyond a right for you to for self-preservation. It's kind of like your job. It's your duty to preserve yourself and to protect yourself. And also because there are people that are not able-bodied that might need our help. Again, just to help your fellow man. There are people out there that are weaker, they have illnesses, they're disabled, etc., and they need protection from those of us that can. So if you have the ability to protect yourself, you should make it a duty to learn that. Back in the old days, a lot of people used to train randomly. It was included in as part of the curriculum in schools. You would learn some youth activities would include boxing and wrestling and things like that. So people were somewhat familiar with at least some way of combating another human being. Now, we go beyond that, so we understand there should be a duty. We should feel compelled to defend ourselves and to be good at defending ourselves, so we're not a burden to ourselves or our families, and so that we can also help those of us, our friends, our family, that are not able to protect themselves. We live in a modern world, and in the modern world, firearms exist. So if you're really interested in self-preservation, you need to understand how to safely use and effectively use a firearm in the modern world. And this is not coming from a place of paranoia that, hey, there's guns everywhere and you're gonna get killed, etc. It's coming from a place of, hey, the bad guys have access to a certain technology. And let's look at it this way. It's very unlikely that you'll ever find yourself in today's modern world in a situation where you may have to begin with, protect yourself. Think of all the days that you haven't had to use any self-protection movements or anything like that, where your awareness and your alertness, your ability to navigate the world intelligently kept you out of trouble, versus the days that you actually had to physically protect yourself. And you'll notice that we live in a relatively safe world. We don't have to constantly be fighting against animals or criminals, etc. The world that we live in is relatively safe. Beyond that, the situations in which a firearm may be involved are very few and far between, and some people can go their entire lives without ever having to face a self-defense or a self-protection or use of force level that would involve a firearm. But because it is possible, and when firearms are in fact involved, the stakes are extremely high, we want to make sure that we're educated on how to use them safely and effectively. This applies to martial artists. If you're a martial artist or a person that studies self-defense and you have never practiced or own a firearm and know how to intelligently, safely, and effectively use it, you're only partially trained. Because again, we live in a modern world in which firearms are a thing, and you may have to deal with somebody that's armed with a firearm, particularly handguns. Of course, it's also intelligent to learn how to use rifles, carbines, and shotguns and such, but particularly handguns, which is the preferred weapon of most criminals. The opposite is also true. There's a lot of people that train with firearms, whether they go through the civilian route, they participate on their own on shooting ranges and courses, etc., or whether they're connected to firearms through military service or law enforcement service. But they train a lot with those firearms, but they never learn how to physically fight. Now, most actual criminal firearms exchanges occur at extremely close distances, and they almost always include either before, during, or after, at some point, there is some sort of physical struggle, whether it's blows or some form of grappling or struggling for a weapon, etc. They almost always include a physical aspect. So if you're only shooting at a range and just plinking at paper targets or steel or whatever you're shooting at, but you never thought of, hey, what would happen if I'm extremely close and, now this person has their hand on my firearm, now I can't shoot, now it becomes a struggle. If you've never explored those things, you're also missing part of your training. So it's really important. So let's boil it down to these two things. If you're a martial artist or a person that is interested in training for self-defense, and you only train physical self-defense and you have never explored the uses, the laws, the morality behind using a firearm effectively, safely, then you're only partially trained. And if you're a person that owns a firearm and has permission to carry that firearm, and all you do is go to the range and you never address how to physically fight another human being, you're only partially trained. You must do both. You have to have a certain element of physical capability and the ability to safely use your firearm. Now, a couple of things about using your firearm for self-defense. Obviously, be familiar with the laws of your state. That's plain and simple. Almost all states have very similar laws. Some of them differ into whether they have castle doctrine. For example, Arizona has a really interesting law where they allow a defensive display of a firearm. And as far as I know, to this date, that is the only state that has that. But each state has different laws with regards of the use of deadly force, which is what covers firearms. So make sure you're familiar with those laws. Obviously, the factor is you have to know how to safely operate that firearm at extreme close quarters, how to effectively use it at extreme close quarters while you are fighting another human being. There are things that happen in that struggle. It's not as simple as, I just got to pull that trigger. There are things that happen in a real life struggle for life and death where you might end up accidentally shooting somebody else. And you certainly do not want that on your conscience, and it's just morally wrong. You have to make sure that you know where those rounds are going, even at extreme close quarters during this struggle. It's not as simple as, hey, there was a bad guy there, so I just pulled out my gun and shot. There are a lot of considerations, both tactically, legally, and morally that you need to be extremely familiar with. There are also strategic things that a lot of people don't think about. Again, it's a lot of just real comfortable talk out there, or what I like to call very cavalier talk, like, well, if I'm in a situation and a guy comes in to rob the place, I'll just pull out my gun and shoot him, and things like that. You have to consider strategy as well as tactics. So for example, there is a time in which you have to tell yourself to wait. Now's not the time. Depending on the type of carry you use with your weapon, there's several ways to conceal the weapon. If you are, let's say for example, a typical scenario that has happened several times and is what most people that carry concealed firearms think about, is let's say you're at a 7-Eleven, or what we used to call the stop and robs, and guess what? As you're getting ready to make your transaction there, a guy walks in, he's got a gun out, and he starts robbing the place. Well, simply cavalierly stating, well, I just put out my gun and shoot him, might get you killed. You have to kind of wait for the right time. You can't just, this person already has a weapon out, has it on display, and you may have to choose, do I need to talk to this person in a way that's going to distract them so I can make my draw and access? Do I have to actually engage the person physically first and then get to my weapon? Those are things and variables that can only be explored with good, safe, realistic training. You cannot just say, oh, well, if the guy does this, I'm just going to do that. That would be a very disingenuous way of looking at the event, because it's not as simple as I have a gun, so I'm going to be able to do whatever I want. You have to take those beats into consideration. Did this person already have a gun displayed? How close are they? Do I need to talk to get to a position where I can get to my gun? Or do I need to physically intervene before I get to my gun? Or is it safer to move to a piece of cover as I'm reaching for my gun? And that's an affectation of distance, proximity, and whatever the actual scenario is. What are the demands that this person has? To wrap it all up, just remember, it's not as simple as, because I can have a gun, my state allows me to have a gun, I'm just going to carry one. You must train safely and effectively with that gun. And if you do have a gun, then you must also, or at least should, there's a lot of people that don't, but you should also train yourself to protect yourself physically, because that gun scenario that you imagine in your head is not going to go quite the same way that you think. As I said before, the other side is, if you train in self-defense or you train in martial arts mainly because you want to protect yourself or be able to defend yourself, then you must learn how to effectively and safely use and operate a handgun, or at least a handgun. It could also include, again, rifles, carbines, shotguns. But you must train with those tools. Lastly, don't be cavalier about whether you're a person, if you have both levels of training. So now you've covered both bases. You know how to shoot and you know how to fight, empty hand, etc. Then you must know and understand strategy. It's not as simple as, hey, there was a gun involved, so I'm just going to pull my gun and we're just going to shoot it out. Understand that different scenarios will require different responses. So be smart about your weapons training. Your self-preservation, your self-protection is extremely important, and it's not a one side of the coin. And beyond that, it includes using your brain. You have to understand strategy and tactics beyond just physical fighting and using a firearm. Once again, thank you for paying attention. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below on the video or send them directly to me. You can look me up on my Facebook pages, Defense Lab Tactical, Edge Protection Systems, or Defense Lab TNT here in Arlington, Texas. I'll look forward to seeing you in our next video. Thanks.